Liberal Professor MOCKS, Vice President of the USA J.D. Vance. His response leaves everyone speechless. Dr. Eleanor Pierce was a name that echoed in the academic and political circles, a professor at a prestigious university known for her biting wit and uncompromising liberal views. In her early 50s, Dr. Pierce had spent decades shaping minds in the classroom, weaving sharp critiques of political conservatism into her lectures. Her passion for progressive causes was evident in every article she published, every keynote she delivered at conferences, and every post she shared on social media. To her followers, she was an intellectual warrior, bravely taking on the status quo and shining a light on the injustices of the world. To her critics, however, she was the embodiment of everything that was wrong with academia, an out-of-touch elitist whose idealism had no practical bearing on the real world. Dr. Pierce's social media presence was just as influential as her academic work, and it was where she was most vocal. A prolific Twitter user, she had built an online following of thousands, mostly left-wing intellectuals, students, and political activists. Her posts were a mix of scholarly analysis, political commentary, and biting satire, often aimed at conservative politicians and public figures. Dr. Pierce did not mince words, nor did she show restraint when it came to calling out what she viewed as the failures of the right. Her influence was undeniable, and her words carried weight. When she spoke, people listened, especially those who shared her ideological leanings. The subject of Dr. Pierce's latest ire was none other than Vice President J.D. Vance, a former author-turned-politician who had risen through the ranks of the Republican Party. Vance was a divisive figure, once celebrated for his memoir Hillbilly Elegy, which chronicled his upbringing in the Rust Belt and his views on class and poverty in America. Vance had become a staunch conservative voice, known for his hard-right positions on issues such as immigration, social welfare, and gun control. His rise to the vice presidency under a polarizing president had further cemented his place in the public eye, with his every move scrutinized by both his supporters and detractors. For Dr. Pierce, Vance was the perfect target. She saw him as the epitome of everything that was wrong with the political establishment, a man who had sold his soul to the corporate elite, a political opportunist who lacked the empathy and understanding to address the real issues facing working-class Americans. She had often criticized his policies in private conversations and academic papers, but now, with the current political climate growing ever more volatile, Dr. Pierce felt it was time to strike a more public blow. It was on a brisk Thursday morning that Dr. Pierce took to Twitter with a post that would spark a political firestorm. In a thread that spanned multiple tweets, she unleashed her full arsenal of scorn against Vance, mocking everything from his academic background to his political positions. She referred to him as a privileged elitist, masquerading as a man of the people, mocking his conservative rhetoric while highlighting the hypocrisy she believed lay beneath his carefully constructed public persona. J.D. Vance, a man who once claimed to understand the plight of the working class, now parades around as the lapdog of the corporate elites. How convenient. "Ivipin name only. Billionaire-backed bureaucrat," one tweet read. In another, she posted, "Vance may have written about poverty, but all he's done since is profit from it. A true champion of the people, if by people you mean the 1%. Her followers were quick to respond, the Twitter thread quickly gaining momentum. Her fans celebrated the post, retweeting it, quoting it with applause emojis, and adding their own critiques of Vance. Many offered their personal critiques of Vance's rise to power, citing his past political flip-flops and his ties to wealthy donors as evidence of his betrayal of the working-class people he once claimed to represent. The professor's words, sharp and biting, were like kindling in a dry forest. Her followers latched onto them eagerly, stoking the fire of political division. Dr. Pierce relished the attention. For her, it was another victory in her lifelong fight against what she viewed as the corporate stranglehold on American politics. The accolades from her followers, many of whom were activists and academics, only fueled her confidence. She knew her words had power, and she had just unleashed them on one of the highest-profile figures in the American political landscape. Her tweet was everywhere, on liberal blogs, progressive political podcasts, and in the comment sections of articles discussing Vance's policies. The buzz was palpable. But this time, something was different. In the past, Dr. Pierce had often mocked right-wing figures, and it was common for her critiques to be met with the expected pushback from conservative voices. But J.D. Vance was no ordinary target. He had become a key figure in the conservative establishment, and his supporters were fervently loyal to him. In a political landscape already divided and polarized, her mockery was poised to ignite a far larger response than usual. As the news of Dr. Pierce's tweet spread, the political world began to buzz. Conservative pundits and commentators quickly took to their platforms to defend Vance, calling out the professor for her elitism and lack of understanding of real American struggles. On conservative news networks and social media channels, Dr. Pierce's post became the hot topic of conversation. Some accused her of being out of touch with the struggles of everyday Americans, while others criticized her for what they saw as a personal attack on Vance's character rather than a substantive political critique. Vance's supporters began to rally behind him, urging him to respond to the professor's mockery. They saw it as another attack on the integrity of conservative values, a deliberate attempt by the left to undermine their political leaders with personal insults rather than engaging in the kind of policy debates they claimed to champion. The political pressure was mounting, and it became clear that Vance's response would be scrutinized by millions. Meanwhile, within the walls of the White House, Vance's advisors were already discussing how to handle the situation. They knew that any response he made could shape the political narrative for days or even weeks. Should he engage in a war of words on Twitter? Should he go on TV and confront Dr. Pierce directly? Or should he take a more calculated diplomatic approach? Vance's supporters, especially those on the right, were eager to see him respond. They saw the professor's remarks as an affront to their values, and they were ready to back him up in whatever way possible. It wasn't just about defending Vance anymore. It was about defending the conservative movement from what they viewed as the constant barrage of elitist criticisms. The question on everyone's mind was, how would J.D. Vance respond? As the days passed, the political tension only heightened. The mockery and counter-mockery continued to escalate, and the stage was set for a confrontation. Dr. Pierce had drawn first blood with her cutting remarks, but now the spotlight was on Vance, and his next move would be critical. His supporters eagerly awaited his response, while Dr. Pierce, feeling emboldened by the attention, was confident that she had made her point. It was clear that this was no longer just a battle between two individuals. It had become a symbol of the deeper political divisions in America. The conflict was about more than just J.D. Vance and Dr. Eleanor Pierce. It was about the war of ideas, the clash of ideologies, and the fate of civil discourse in an increasingly polarized nation. Both sides braced for what was coming next. J.D. Vance, the Vice President of the United States, had become a central figure in American politics in recent years. His rise from an impoverished childhood in the Rust Belt to a best-selling author, and then to a key player in the conservative movement, was nothing short of extraordinary. His memoir, Hillbilly Elegy, which chronicled his working-class upbringing and the complex relationship between social mobility and systemic poverty, had garnered significant praise when it was published. However, it was his transition into politics that truly thrust him into the public spotlight. Vance's political persona was built on a foundation of sharp conservative ideals. His critics often labeled him as a symbol of Republican opportunism, citing his shift from an academic, almost intellectual persona to a highly pragmatic politician willing to pander to the right-wing base. Supporters, on the other hand, viewed him as a champion of the forgotten American worker, someone who could speak to the plight of rural America while advocating for traditional values and limited government intervention. As vice president, Vance had solidified his position within the establishment. He had deftly navigated the complex web of American politics, aligning himself with the more populist, nationalist elements of the Republican Party, while simultaneously keeping a foot in the door with more establishment-oriented conservatives. His public appearances were often met with fervent applause from his base, but also intense scrutiny from his critics. It was a delicate balancing act, and Vance had grown accustomed to the pressure. When Dr. Eleanor Pierce, the outspoken liberal professor, unleashed her scathing critique of him on social media, Vance was initially caught off guard. He had dealt with criticism before, but this was different. Dr. Pierce, with her academic prestige and large following, had launched a personal and ideological attack that reached a wide audience. Her mocking tone and sharp words had struck a nerve, not just with Vance, but with many in his camp. His supporters, especially those in the conservative media, were quick to rally behind him, but Vance knew that reacting impulsively would not be the wisest course of action. The vice president retreated into the confines of the White House, seeking counsel from his closest advisors and political team. His aides gathered in the Oval Office for a series of urgent meetings, discussing the best way to handle the growing backlash. The situation had the potential to turn into a major public relations debacle, especially considering the polarizing nature of Vance's politics. Would it be more effective to strike back, engage in a public war of words, or would that only escalate the situation further? Vance's senior communications advisor, Sarah Reynolds, suggested the former. "The best thing we can do is go on the offensive. Pierce is baiting you. Take the gloves off. Let the world know exactly why she's wrong." Vance paused, taking in her words but sensing that this approach might not work in his favor. His chief of staff, Mark Thompson, disagreed. "You have to remember, sir, this is about more than just Dr. Pierce. This could be the moment where we either sink into the same partisan bickering that has consumed Washington, or we rise above it." Vance sat back in his chair, contemplating. The vice president's political instincts were razor sharp, but this was different. This wasn't a political debate over policy. It was a personal attack on his character, his beliefs, and his vision for the country. The question was not just about winning the battle in the media, it was about winning the broader war of ideas. He was aware that the country was deeply divided, and if he retaliated in kind, it could deepen the polarization that had already gripped the nation. After hours of deliberation, Vance made his decision. He would not engage in a combative exchange. He would instead take a different approach, one that would emphasize civility, reason, and intellectual honesty. The decision was not an easy one. By opting not to retaliate, he was passing up an opportunity to score political points with his base, who were eager to see him fire back at the professor. But Vance believed in something larger than personal vindication. He saw this as an opportunity to challenge the status quo, to shift the conversation away from petty insults and toward a more substantive dialogue on the future of the country. Over the next few days, Vance worked closely with his speechwriters and communications team to craft a response that would resonate beyond the immediate political conflict. The response would be a carefully measured statement that avoided the personal jabs that had characterized so much of the political discourse of late. Instead, Vance chose to address the broader issue of the decline of civil discourse and the importance of understanding and engaging with those who held differing viewpoints. Vance's response was delivered not in a tweet or a soundbite, but in a formal address to the nation. Standing at a podium in the White House briefing room, with the American flag proudly displayed behind him, Vance spoke directly to the public. "My fellow Americans," he began, his voice steady and calm, "I stand before you today not to respond to the attacks of one individual, but to address a larger issue that is plaguing our nation. In recent days, we've seen a series of personal attacks and public mockery aimed at those with whom we disagree. This is not new, but it has become all too common. We have entered a period in our nation's history where personal insults have taken the place of meaningful discourse, where sound bites are more important than substance, and where the need to win has overshadowed the need to understand." Vance paused, his eyes scanning the room, his tone measured but firm. "It is easy to engage in a war of words. It's easy to mock, to belittle, to tear others down. But that is not the path that I believe will lead us forward. As your Vice President, my responsibility is not just to defend myself, but to promote a vision of politics that rises above the petty division that has infected our public life, a vision of unity, respect, and intellectual honesty." Vance's words were a deliberate departure from the usual political rhetoric. He did not engage in a tit-for-tat with Dr. Pierce. He did not respond to her criticisms with counterattacks or insults. Instead, he chose to elevate the conversation, focusing on the need for a more thoughtful and respectful approach to political discourse. "I understand that we disagree on many issues," he continued. "That's the nature of politics. Different people, different perspectives. But in a democracy, our ability to disagree civilly is what makes us strong. It is in the exchange of ideas, in the willingness to listen to those who challenge us, that we find the solutions to the challenges that face us as a nation." Vance's statement was not just a defense of his own character. It was a call to action for the American public. He emphasized that the future of the country depended on the willingness of citizens to engage with one another in good faith, to acknowledge the complexity of the issues at hand, and to work together to find common ground. His response was not about winning an argument, but about fostering a culture of respect and understanding. "In this moment, we must ask ourselves what kind of country we want to be," Vance concluded. "Do we want to be a nation divided by bitterness and vitriol, or do we want to be a nation where ideas are debated honestly and respectfully, where we listen to one another, and where we work toward a better future for all?" The response was met with mixed reactions. His supporters hailed the speech as a masterclass in leadership and maturity. They praised Vance for rising above the political mudslinging and for delivering a message of hope and unity in a time of deep division. Conservative pundits lauded his emphasis on civility and the need to return to a more substantive form of political engagement. Critics, on the other hand, dismissed the speech as a hollow attempt to avoid confrontation. Some on the left argued that Vance was simply deflecting from the valid criticisms leveled against him by Dr. Pierce, while others questioned the sincerity of his message, pointing out that his political record seemed at odds with his call for unity. But for Vance, the response was never about winning a short-term political battle. It was about setting the tone for a different kind of political dialogue, one that moved beyond the constant cycle of insults and attacks. He knew that the road ahead would be difficult, that the divisions in the country were not going to be healed by one speech. But he believed that by taking this step, by choosing to engage thoughtfully rather than react impulsively, he had started a conversation that could, over time, lead to a more productive and respectful political environment. The aftermath of Vice President J.D. Vance's carefully crafted response to Dr. Eleanor Pierce's scathing mockery was nothing short of seismic. It sparked a wave of discussion across political and academic spheres, each side dissecting his words and weighing their implications. For Dr. Pierce, the liberal professor whose sharp critique had ignited this firestorm, the response was initially a source of confusion. She had expected a fierce retort, perhaps even a personal attack from the vice president. What she got instead was a statement that felt almost like an intellectual slap in the face. A measured, thoughtful call for civility and dialogue that left little room for the kind of vitriol she had aimed at him. At first, Dr. Pierce could hardly process the response. In her mind, she had been a part of a larger ideological battle, one that was marked by sharp, clear lines of division. To her, Vance represented everything wrong with contemporary politics. His connections to wealthy donors, his hard-right stances, and his role in a political system she viewed as riddled with corruption. In her eyes, mocking him, calling out his hypocrisy, and drawing attention to his perceived failures was an important part of political discourse. The response she received, however, defied her expectations. Rather than sinking to the level of combative rhetoric, Vance had chosen to elevate the conversation, making it about something bigger than themselves. A call for unity, for reasoned debate, and for the kind of civil discourse that had long seemed to be in short supply. Dr. Pierce found herself unsettled. She had anticipated a messy, partisan war of words, something that would fuel her argument that the right was unwilling to engage in rational dialogue. But instead, she had been faced with an example of precisely what she had been claiming was missing in the political world, an appeal for higher standards in public discourse. The calm, reflective nature of Vance's speech made it difficult for her to respond in kind. What was left for her to do now? Could she continue to ridicule him when he had shown such restraint? Or would this force her to reconsider her own approach to political engagement? In the days that followed, Dr. Pierce found herself engaging in deep reflection. Her usual posts on social media, filled with sharp critiques of conservatives, suddenly seemed less satisfying. She had spent years positioning herself as a defender of free speech and academic freedom, but the ease with which she had dismissed Vance's humanity and political position began to feel at odds with those values. Could she truly champion discourse? If she wasn't willing to listen to her opponents and engage with them honestly, she began to question her approach. Was she contributing to the very culture of political polarization she so often decried? Her followers continued to cheer her on, but she felt a growing sense of discomfort. Her attacks had been swift and perhaps too quick. The response from Vance had forced her to take a hard look at her role in the national conversation. Meanwhile, the public's reaction to Vance's speech was explosive. Social media platforms erupted, and mainstream news outlets dedicated hours of coverage to the speech, framing it as a defining moment in the ongoing culture wars. On one side, there were those who hailed the vice president's words as a much-needed example of leadership and maturity in a time of extreme political polarization. On the other, critics seized on what they perceived as a missed opportunity for Vance to confront Dr. Pierce directly, accusing him of evading the issues at hand. In the conservative world, Vance's response was widely celebrated. Pundits on Fox News and other right-leaning platforms praised him for rising above the fray, applauding his ability to hold the moral high ground, while simultaneously addressing the decline of political civility. Many saw his speech as a moment of clarity, a rare example of a political leader refusing to get sucked into the cycle of negativity and instead using his platform to advocate for respect and understanding. "We need more leaders like J.D. Vance," said one conservative commentator. "This is the kind of leadership that transcends partisanship. He didn't just respond to an attack, he set a new standard for how we should engage with each other in this country. On the left, The reactions were more mixed. Some progressives were taken aback by the calmness of Vance's response, with some even conceding that his message had merit. However, many were quick to point out that the speech was little more than a well-crafted deflection. Critics argued that by avoiding a direct confrontation with Dr. Pierce's critique, Vance had sidestepped the real issues. For them, the response felt like an attempt to gloss over the substantive criticisms of his policies, particularly his record on social issues and his ties to wealthy donors. Vance's speech was just another example of a politician trying to avoid the tough questions, said a prominent Liberal columnist. He's good at playing the role of the above-it-all politician, but what about the actual issues? What about the way he's furthering the wealth divide and ignoring the needs of working-class Americans? The debate grew even more heated as social media platforms became ground zero for the unfolding war of words. Some of Dr. Pierce's followers, disillusioned by Vance's response, doubled down on their support for the professor, claiming that Vance had missed the point entirely. They argued that Vance's call for unity and intellectual honesty was an attempt to silence dissent and avoid confronting the real issues of inequality, corporate influence, and environmental degradation that were central to Pierce's critique. Yet, there were others who found themselves inspired by Vance's approach. Some moderates, disillusioned with the perpetual bickering and division, began to openly discuss the importance of shifting away from the combative politics that had come to define both major parties. For them, Vance's words were a much-needed reminder of the power of respectful discourse, even in the face of deep ideological differences. This shift in tone created a ripple effect across the broader political landscape. Political commentators, journalists, and ordinary citizens began to debate what it meant to engage in meaningful political discourse. Was it possible to disagree without becoming enemies? Could leaders show respect for those with opposing views without compromising their core beliefs? Vance's speech became the center of this debate, as it set the stage for a much larger conversation about the future of political engagement in an increasingly divided America. As the weeks went on, the ripple effect from Vance's response continued to reverberate. Dr. Pierce, though initially shaken by his calm demeanor, found herself part of a new national dialogue, a conversation about the decay of civil discourse and the need for a more thoughtful, empathetic approach to political engagement. Many in the media noted the contrast between Vance's approach and the rhetoric of the president's other political adversaries. For some, it was an invitation to rise above the constant back and forth of partisan warfare. For others, it was a challenge to reconsider the way they had been engaging in politics themselves. Vance's call for unity did not result in a magical resolution to the nation's polarization. Political divides remained as sharp as ever, but his message, for better or worse, had ignited a long overdue conversation about the nature of public discourse. It forced people to reflect on how they engaged with the other side, whether through snide remarks on Twitter or through the more nuanced forms of debate that Vance championed. Whether or not Vance's message would have a lasting impact on the country's deeply polarized political environment was uncertain. What was clear, however, was that his decision to respond thoughtfully had sparked a new dialogue about the kind of political discourse the American people wanted. It became apparent that this was not simply a matter of defending or attacking Vance or Dr. Pierce. It was a moment for reflection, an opportunity to rethink the way politics could be practiced in a country that was growing increasingly weary of the constant cycle of division. For Dr. Pierce, the battle was no longer just between her and Vance. It was part of a larger struggle, one that involved a reckoning with her own approach to political discourse. And for Vance, his response was an invitation to the public to reconsider the nature of political engagement itself. Would America rise to the challenge, or would it remain entrenched in its partisan warfare? Time would tell. The public exchange between Vice President J.D. Vance and Dr. Eleanor Pierce marked a turning point for both parties. Dr. Pierce, a liberal professor known for her sharp critiques of right-wing figures like Vance, expected a combative response to her mockery. Instead, Vance responded with measured civility, calling for unity and intellectual honesty. His calm, reflective tone caught her off guard and prompted her to reconsider her approach to political discourse. Initially dismissing Vance's response as a typical tactic of those in power, Dr. Pierce began to see its value over time. She realized that civility could lead to more meaningful dialogue and that it was possible to challenge ideas without resorting to personal attacks. Though she still valued critique, the exchange made her reflect on the balance between passion and respectful engagement. Vance's decision to rise above combative rhetoric enhanced his reputation as a leader who transcended partisan divides. While some of his supporters wanted a stronger retort, his emphasis on civility resonated with many who were weary of constant political conflict. His response served as a reminder that respectful dialogue was possible even in a polarized political climate. Ultimately, the exchange between Vance and Pierce highlighted the importance of civil discourse. Dr. Pierce began to rethink her approach to political debate, and Vance solidified his status as a leader who prioritized thoughtful discussion over political expediency. Their interaction became a symbol of the need for more respectful engagement in today's polarized world.